Hello students, my name is Dr. Lewis, and welcome to the second lecture in our course on European history. This lecture is entitled The Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. In our previous lecture, we looked at how traditional European feudal society was impacted by the development of the Atlantic world commerce, the Protestant Reformation. Today, what we'll be looking at primarily is ideas about science and how science led to a philosophical movement called the Enlightenment. The main questions we'll be dealing with are, number one, what role did science play in changing Europe? Number two, what were the values of the philosophical movement we'd refer to as the Enlightenment? Number three, who was it and how did ideas about the Enlightenment get spread throughout Europe? And number four, how did the Enlightenment ultimately impact the world and help to create the modern world that we live in? In our modern minds, science is thought of as a separate discipline, very much unrelated to philosophy and the traditions of the humanities. During the 16th century, science, though, was intimately interconnected with ideas about the world around us, not just the physical world, but our larger philosophical views of all things. This aspect originated in the fact that the Roman Catholic Church, during its time of dominance and power in Europe, promoted what was called the geocentric tradition of understanding the universe. What the geocentric tradition argued, despite any relevant scientific information, was that the Earth was the center of the universe. And since the Earth was God's special creation, the center of the universe, that the Pope, as God's appointed leader on this planet, was therefore the center of the universe and the undisputed power in all things. What helped to change and radically transform this geocentric model was the creation of what's called the heliocentric tradition that was promoted by two different well-renowned scientists named Copernicus and Galileo. What Copernicus did during the 16th century was utilize math and different astronomical observations to understand that the Earth could not be physically the center of the universe. That looking at different things that revolved around us, that the Earth, while it might be the center of something, it certainly could not be the center of a solar system or a universe. For the fact that it was such a radical idea, what Copernicus did was he waited until 2 weeks before he died before publishing his observations. Therefore, the Roman Catholic Church could not react to the ideas of Copernicus, and in turn, the Pope did not have enough time to excommunicate Copernicus from the Roman Catholic Church in the same way that he had done to Martin Luther. One of Copernicus' students, observer of the universe named Galileo, took a very different route with his life. What Galileo did during the 16th and particularly the mid-17th century was use Copernican theory, math, and the newly developed telescope to ultimately prove that the Earth could not be the center of the universe by observing the way different bodies revolved around the Earth, that the Earth was also a body revolving around the sun. The problem for Galileo is that unlike his predecessor Copernicus, Galileo decided not to wait until his deathbed to publish his ideas. When Galileo published his ideas, the Pope gave him an opportunity to recant on his so-called heresy and to publish something else. Galileo, to the great credit of science and the scientific tradition, decided to ignore the request of the Pope and to double down on his theories, publishing a book stating that ultimately the Earth could not possibly be the center of the universe. Based upon this heresy, the Pope excommunicated Galileo from the Roman Catholic Church and put him on house arrest the rest of his life. And he wasn't ultimately forgiven by the Roman Catholic Church until the year 1989, when Pope John Paul II finally, and bless his soul, said Galileo was correct. To put this in perspective, the reason why the Catholic Church was, well, why they were so pissed at this man, was that by showing that the Earth was not the center of the universe, it undermined the entire idea that the Pope was the center of the universe and therefore should be in control of all things. What the works of Copernicus and Galileo ultimately led to was the creation of a new scientific method by an English scientist named Sir Isaac Newton. What Sir Isaac Newton did was took different ideas about observing the world and about rational evidence and about methodology, and particularly about testing one's evidence to create what we now know as the modern scientific method. Sir Isaac Newton was an incredibly religious man, and he wasn't against the idea of religion having an important role in life, but what Sir Isaac Newton said is that theological texts were there to tell us about the human condition and how human beings should relate with each other and relate with the divine. But that religious texts could not and should not be looked to inform us about all things of this physical world. Sir Isaac Newton, still to this day, even by people like Einstein, is known to be the greatest scientist to ever live, because what he did is he provided people a new structure and a new methodology to understand life, the universe, and really everything. Ultimately, what the works of Copernicus, Galileo, and Sir Isaac Newton did was undermine the authority of the Roman Catholic Church when it came to the control of knowledge and power over society. The scientific revolution that we just described was not an isolated event, but laid the foundations for a later philosophical and cultural movement referred to as the Enlightenment. A strict textbook definition of the Enlightenment would term it as, quote, a philosophical and cultural movement of the 17th and 18th centuries, primarily popularized by the French, emphasizing the use of reason to scrutinize previously accepted doctrines and traditions in science, religion, politics, and social theory. Since Copernicus and Galileo had been able to utilize the methodology of science to prove that the Earth was not the center of the universe, the next step in logical thought was that the Pope was also not the center of the universe, and that perhaps the ideas put forward by the Pope were not inspired by God, but were inspired by man. What Enlightenment thinkers believed, in a very literal sense, is that science and reason could potentially explain all facets of the human phenomenon through completely secular terms that did not involve spirits, religion, or the divine. One of the most radical ideas of Enlightenment thinkers was rejecting the concept of original sin. Going back to the book of Genesis, the idea that Adam and Eve had fallen from grace there in the Garden of Eden, and therefore that humanity since then had been cursed with a sinful nature that made us inherently evil, that needed the salvation of the Roman Catholic Church. What Enlightenment thinkers did was they rejected the notion of this story and said that human beings are born neither good nor evil, but that we are products of the world around us, of the social forces around us, and that human beings could be bred to be either good or evil. What this led to was a notion that the current social system was not something put in place by God as a natural order, but was an unnatural order created by man, and that man in turn logically could create a natural order if they created an order in tune with ideas of science, philosophy, and particularly the radical notion of equality. What science did in undermining the Roman Catholic Church was led to new philosophical notions that inspired ideas of political and social reform, and later on in our next lecture, directly, ideas of political revolution. One of the most radical notions brought forward by the Protestant Reformation that we reviewed in a previous lecture is the idea that individuals were somehow a special creation of God, and that individuals could therefore create a special one-on-one relationship with God. Traditionally, Roman Catholics believed that the only way for an individual to interact with the divine was through the intermediary of a priest, that one needed special training to be able to talk to God. Protestants started believing that we were literally each individual creations of God, had a personal relationship with God, and therefore the world around us should be based upon protecting the rights and liberties of the individual. Particularly, Protestants started emphasizing the idea that what it meant to be an individual was to have one's personal freedom protected and one's personal property protected, and that all governments should be instituted and created to create laws that protect the natural rights of property and freedom instilled by God on individuals. One of the other radical religious notions that came out of the Enlightenment period were two different theological traditions that originally were based out of Christianity, but came to very, very different conclusions when it came to the relationship between God and between the individual. What I'm referring to here are the divergent traditions of deism and Unitarianism. What deists and Unitarians believe in is they believe in a God, a higher power that created the universe, but that this God was much like a clockmaker that designed and created a very intricate and wonderful clock, set that clock in motion, then allowed the clock to define itself. What they believed is that God created the universe, but that man, as an individual, defines their place in the universe. For the fact that deists and Unitarians do not believe in the idea of divine intervention, and they do not believe in the power of prayer, they believe that the individual was left to their own strengths and to their own talents to define the world around them, that God would not define that world for them based upon their prayers or their wishes. Some very famous individuals that you may have heard of who were, at their times of being alive, associated with deism and Unitarianism, but oftentimes now are associated with Christian traditions. George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine. Who were these people? These people were the founding fathers of the American Republic, those who led and defined the American Revolution. What they all have in common, outside of a notion of wanting to change the world around them, is that none of them believed in the power of prayer or divine intervention. They were all deists or Unitarians who believed that God had given them certain abilities, certain talents, so that they could in turn define the social and political world around them. What the Founding Fathers were, in the American experience, was a product of the European Enlightenment, who believed the ideas of progress and changing the social world around you would not be rooted in the power of divine entities, but rooted instead upon political activism and revolution. In order to understand something about philosophy and political ideas, we need to know something about the historic context that they were developed in, because people don't simply create ideas on their own, but their ideas are a product of the world in which they live. The one political leader who helped to define much of the world of the Enlightenment was a French king by the name of Louis XIV, who was nicknamed the Sun King. There's two main reasons why political ideas were so much rooted, not so much in the ideas of Louis XIV, but a reaction against this man. Number one, Louis XIV, the Sun King, in terms of European monarchs, still to this day is the longest ruling monarch in all of European history. This man was on his throne for 72 years, 110 days, which is really not fair, because currently Queen Elizabeth II of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, she's been on the throne for 64 years, 11 months, and 15 days. But she didn't take the throne until she was 26. Louis XIV took the throne when he was 5 years old. If you can imagine being 5 years old, being king of a nation, one of the largest empires in the world. Yeah, that's a natural, rational system. Not at all. Louis XIV was in power for the longest of any European monarchs, and his ideas about politics were completely rooted in trying to enforce and restore old ideas about the divine right of rule. Louis XIV claimed to be an incredibly devout Catholic, and he believed that the Pope should be the center of all political and social life. He literally believed that he had been appointed by God to lead over France and the French people and the French Empire. What's awkward with Louis, though, is that oftentimes the things one might associate in the modern mind with Christian values, we oftentimes would not see reflected in Louis XIV's life. Number one, instead of being kind and peaceful, he was an incredibly authoritarian leader. Louis's most famous quote about politics is he was asked once about politics and he said, "I am the state," which means anything about law or about political will was completely embodied in one individual. Louis XIV believed himself to be a symbol of authority, stability, and unity for all of European people. What Enlightenment philosophers ultimately did when living under the rule of Louis XIV was they looked at how he ruled over things, how unnatural his rule was, and created political ideas that rejected the rule of Louis XIV. Even though Louis defined himself as a devout Catholic, one of the reasons why Louis is a bit of a contradiction is that Louis embodies his entire reign over France and is a major leader in Europe by building, at the time, the largest palace that Europeans had ever known. It was called the Palace of Versailles, which is about 15 miles outside of Paris. And if you ever get a chance to visit France, I would recommend visiting the Palace of Versailles. It's one of the most amazing architectural feats ever in European history. The problem with Versailles is severalfold. Number one, it's not just a place for Louis to rule. It is a direct extension of his authoritarian rule. It's a place for showmanship, for power. Versailles was literally created for political purposes. Number one, since it was the largest palace in all of Europe, every European leader was jealous of Versailles and wanted to build a palace as large or perhaps larger to show that they could be as powerful and authoritarian as Louis was. Number two, what Louis did intentionally at the Palace of Versailles is if you think about some place where you would train a dog, a kennel, a breeder, where dogs are sort of whipped into shape. What Louis XIV did is he utilized the Palace of Versailles to whip the French nobility into shape on a bit of a trade-off. Number one, the Palace of Versailles was, during its time and its heyday when it's built, essentially the largest party place in all of Europe. The Palace of Versailles could host up to 10,000 guests at a time, and every French noble was required every year to spend a certain amount of time at the Palace of Versailles, where they would spend their free time wining and dining, and literally, in terms of aristocratic culture, having orgies. That's all they did. They got drunk and they had orgies at Versailles. And who paid for it? The peasants of Paris and of the rest of France paid extreme amounts in taxation to fund all of this. But when these aristocrats weren't wining and dining and having sex with Lord only knows who and what they had to do in their time of service was to service every single whim of Louis XIV. And I don't mean just little things. I mean literally Louis XIV, he didn't pull his own pants up. He would have an aristocrat do that. When he went to the bathroom, he didn't wipe himself. He would force an aristocrat to do that as a sign of submission. And what you did as an aristocrat is, in turn, when you weren't serving the king, you got to wine and dine and party, and you didn't have to pay a penny in taxes to pay for any of this. While Louis's traditions worked well for him while he was alive, he set in precedent, number one, the increase of huge social and class tensions within France, because things like this, they're expensive. If you're not forcing the wealthy people who are enjoying these things to pay for them and forcing commoners to pay for it, well, eventually it might lead to a few different political problems. The German philosopher Karl Marx once said, "The philosophers of the world have only interpreted it in certain ways. The point is to change it." It's one thing for philosophers to come up with new ideas about the world, but it's a whole other thing on whether or not they actually have an impact on the world. And many of the ideas of the Enlightenment would not have been spread had it not been for the great celebrity of the Enlightenment, a man named Voltaire, who our modern equivalent would be Stephen Colbert of the Late Night Show. Voltaire was a ruthless satirist who utilized poetry, literature, and plays to show the irony and the absurdity of traditional European world, and to critique this world, hoping that others in turn would change it. The main book that Voltaire wrote and that influenced and spread many of the ideas about the Enlightenment was a book called Candide, published in the year 1759. The main theme that Candide tried to attack was the problem of evil in the world. Traditionally, people looked at the world in Europe through a philosophy of what one could call optimism, believing that they lived in the best of all possible worlds because God had created the world in such a way, and the evil and suffering were somehow necessary. Through the character of Candide, Voltaire mocked optimism, he mocked ideas about the church, aristocratic arrogance, warfare, and the character of Candide over and over. He goes through the worst of all possible sins, and he's friends with a philosopher named Pangloss, and Pangloss over and over says, well, this is necessary because we live in the best of all possible worlds, because God created all of these sins, and all of these sins happen for a reason. Now, if one simply accepts that all things that happen in their life happen for a divinely inspired reason, then why would anyone ever try to change the world around them? What Candide did by mocking these ideas and showing them on the most absurd lights was that Voltaire was able to utilize satire and humor to popularize ideas about the Enlightenment. Once ideas about the Enlightenment became popularized not just in high culture, but in common, everyday people's culture, progress in popular culture started becoming intertwined, spreading the ideas of the Enlightenment throughout all peoples in Europe, eventually culminating in our next lecture on the French Revolution. What the Enlightenment did in terms of its legacies, really in many ways threefold, leading to new ideas about democracy and the idea of revolution to bring about democracy. Number one, the Enlightenment helped to decrease the role of the church in popular life. The church started losing its monopoly upon education and politics, and people started using ideas, particularly secular ideas, to analyze the world around them, about human behavior, about how society and governments should be set up. Number two, because of individuals like Voltaire, philosophy became part of urban culture. And something still to this day that you can see as a difference between European culture and American culture is that if you go to pubs or taverns in Europe, people will talk about everyday life, they'll talk about sports, but they oftentimes sit around drinking beer and talking about ideas. And this is a long-standing tradition in Europe that goes across the currents of all European nations, where people talk about ideas, they talk about the world around them, in particular talk about the idea of what it means to be a citizen, what it means to live under the rule of a nation state, and the role that nation state should play in an individual's life. Number three, since Enlightenment thinkers believed that the individual was not inherently good or evil, but was shaped by the world around them, they started trying to influence governments into having a greater role in people's lives. The state shouldn't simply play a role to defend people against foreign powers or foreign aggression, but that the state should play an active role in guiding and defining the social and economic development of a nation and its people. What this led to was the development of new ideas about politics, about democracy, leading to improvements in education, the creation of public utilities, and eventually, in our next lecture, culminating in the French Revolution. While Copernicus and Galileo started their careers simply observing the skies, what they eventually led to was the overthrow of the French monarchy and the institute of an era that we'd now call the modern period, where the individual was no longer simply a part of society, then the individual was an integral part of a larger social network, and that governments and politics should be defined by protecting the freedoms and the rights of the individual. We'll explore this more in our next lecture on the French Revolution.